My name is Marcus, and what I'm about to share happened during my 3 months working as a night security guard at the Whitmore Natural History Museum in Portland, Oregon. This was back in 2018, and I took the job because I needed something that paid decent money while I finished my degree in archaeology. The position seemed perfect. Quiet nights, time to study, and I'd be surrounded by the kind of artifacts and specimens I was passionate about learning more about in my academic work. The Whitmore isn't one of those massive, world-famous institutions you see in movies. It's a mid-sized museum that focuses primarily on Pacific Northwest natural history, with extensive collections of fossils, minerals, and preserved specimens from the region. The building itself dates back to 1923, a 3-story structure with that classic institutional architecture, high ceilings, marble floors, and long corridors lined with glass display cases. During the day, it's filled with school groups and families, but at night, it becomes something entirely different. The job requirements were straightforward enough. Walk predetermined routes through all 3 floors every hour, check that all doors and windows remain secure, monitor the climate control systems that protect the more delicate specimens, and document anything unusual in the security log. Dr. Helena Vasquez, the museum director, explained during my interview that they'd had issues with temperature fluctuations affecting some of their more valuable pieces, so maintaining detailed records was crucial for insurance purposes. My supervisor was Ray Kowalski, a guy in his 50s who'd been doing security work for various museums and galleries around the city for over 20 years. Ray had this methodical way of explaining things, like he'd given the same orientation speech to dozens of guards before me. He walked me through each which exhibits contained the most valuable pieces, and showing me how to use the electronic keycard system that logged section of the building, pointing out the locations of panic buttons, explaining every door I opened. The museum's layout was fairly logical. The ground floor housed the main lobby, gift shop, and temporary exhibition space. The second floor contained the permanent natural history displays, fossils, mineral collections, dioramas of local ecosystems, and a section dedicated to indigenous artifacts from various Pacific Northwest tribes. The third floor was split between administrative offices, a research library, and storage areas where they kept specimens not currently on display. What Ray didn't mention during that first walkthrough, and what I only discovered during my initial nights on the job, was how different the building felt after hours. It wasn't just the obvious things like the absence of visitors or the dimmed lighting. There was something about the way sounds carried through those long corridors, how your footsteps seemed to echo differently depending on which section you were walking through. The climate control system made this constant low humming noise that you barely noticed during the day. But at 3 in the morning, it became this persistent background drone that made every other sound seem amplified. My first week passed without incident. I'd arrive at 11 p.m., get briefed by the evening security guard who worked until midnight, and then settle into the routine. The museum provided a small office near the main entrance where I could study between rounds, complete with a desk, comfortable chair, and coffee maker. I'd do my hourly walks, check the environmental monitoring systems, and spend the rest of the time working on my thesis research about pre-Columbian trade networks in the region. It was during my second week that I first noticed something that didn't quite fit the pattern Ray had described. I was doing my 2 a.m. round walking through the second floor mineral collection when I heard what sounded like glass tapping against glass. Not breaking or cracking, just a gentle rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere among the display cases. I stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound had already stopped. I spent an extra 15 minutes examining every case in that section, looking for any signs of damage or loose fittings that might explain the noise. Everything appeared normal. The cases were secure. The specimens were properly positioned, and the environmental readings were all within normal ranges. I made a note in the log about investigating an unidentified sound but finding no evidence of any problems. The tapping happened again 3 nights later, this time during my 4 a.m. round. Same section, same gentle rhythm, but lasting only about 10 seconds before it stopped. Again, I found nothing out of place when I investigated. I started paying more attention to that particular area during my rounds. but for the next week, everything remained quiet. Then during my third week, I encountered Dr. Elaine Morrison. Dr. Morrison was the museum's chief curator, a woman in her early 60s who specialized in paleontology and had been with the institution for over 15 years. I'd seen her name on various plaques and exhibition credits, but we'd never met since she typically worked during regular daytime hours. I was surprised to find her in the building at 2:30 in the morning, working alone in the third-floor research area. She explained that she was preparing for a major exhibition opening in a few months and often came in during off hours when she could work without interruptions. She seemed friendly enough, asking about my studies and expressing genuine interest in my archaeological background. What struck me as unusual wasn't her presence. Ray had mentioned that occasionally staff members would work late or come in early, but rather her specific interest in my security rounds. She asked detailed questions about which areas I visited, how long I spent in each section, and whether I'd noticed anything out of the ordinary during my time there. When I mentioned the glass tapping sounds from the mineral collection, Dr. Morrison's expression changed. She became very focused, asking me to describe exactly when and where I'd heard the sounds, how long they'd lasted, and whether I'd observed any patterns. She took notes while I spoke, which seemed like an unusually thorough response to what I'd assumed was probably just building settling or minor equipment noise. She then asked if I'd be willing to modify my rounds slightly, spending a few extra minutes in the mineral section each night and keeping more detailed records of any unusual sounds or observations. She explained that they'd been having some concerns about the stability of certain display cases, and that my reports could help them identify potential problems before they became serious issues. Looking back, I should have asked more questions about what specific concerns they had. I should have wondered why a paleontologist would be so interested in problems with mineral display cases. But at the time, I was just pleased that a senior staff member was taking my observations seriously, and that I could contribute something meaningful beyond basic security duties. That conversation with Dr. Morrison marked the beginning of what would become the most unsettling 3 weeks of my life. The next night, I followed Dr. Morrison's suggestion and spent additional time in the mineral collection during each round. I brought a small notebook to document the exact time, duration, and characteristics of any sounds I encountered. The first 2 nights yielded nothing unusual, but on the third night, something happened that made me question everything I thought I understood about the building. I was conducting my 3 a.m. round when I heard the tapping again, but this time it was different. Instead of the gentle rhythmic sound I'd grown accustomed to, this was more urgent, almost frantic. Multiple sources seemed to be creating the noise simultaneously, coming from different cases throughout the room. I stood perfectly still and counted at least 5 distinct tapping patterns occurring at the same time. What happened next defied any logical explanation I could construct. As I moved closer to investigate, the tapping stopped abruptly, but I could swear I saw movement inside one of the larger display cases. Not the specimens themselves moving, but shadows shifting behind the glass in ways that didn't correspond to my position or the overhead lighting. I spent nearly 40 minutes examining every case in that section, taking detailed notes about the layout, the specimens on display, and the environmental conditions. Everything appeared normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The case where I thought I'd seen the shadows contained a collection of quartz crystals and mineral samples from various mines throughout Oregon and Washington. Beautiful pieces, some quite large, but nothing that should have been casting the kind of shadows I'd observed. The following evening, Dr. Morrison was waiting for me when I arrived for my shift. She asked to review my notes from the previous night, reading them with the same focused attention she'd shown during our first conversation. When she finished, she looked up at me with an expression that seemed to combine concern with something I couldn't quite identify. Relief maybe, or confirmation of something she'd already suspected. She told me that the museum had been experiencing what she diplomatically referred to as environmental irregularities in several sections of the building. Temperature fluctuations that didn't correspond to any mechanical issues with the climate control systems. Humidity readings that changed dramatically within minutes despite stable atmospheric conditions. Most puzzling, they'd been finding specimens in display cases positioned differently than they'd been left, with no evidence of the cases being opened or tampered with. Dr. Morrison explained that these incidents had been occurring sporadically for about 6 months, but they'd increased in frequency over the past few weeks. The museum's board was growing concerned about potential insurance implications if valuable specimens were somehow being damaged by unknown factors. They needed documentation of exactly when and where these irregularities were occurring to determine whether they were dealing with equipment failures, building structural issues, or something else entirely. She asked if I'd be willing to expand my documentation beyond just the mineral collection. She wanted me to note any unusual sounds, temperature variations, or visual anomalies throughout the building during my nightly rounds. She also gave me a digital thermometer and humidity gauge, asking me to take readings in specific locations and record them alongside my other observations. What she didn't tell me, and what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that I wasn't the first night guard to report these phenomena. My predecessor, a guy named David Castellanos, had documented similar experiences during his final month on the job. According to his logs, which I wasn't given access to at the time, the incidents had escalated significantly before his departure. David's final entries described sounds and visual disturbances that went far beyond simple tapping noises. Armed with my new equipment and expanded responsibilities, I began conducting more thorough investigations during my rounds. The digital instruments Dr. Morrison provided were significantly more sensitive than the building's standard monitoring equipment, and they immediately revealed patterns that the regular systems had been missing. Temperature variations of 10 to 15 degrees would occur within minutes in specific locations, then return to normal just as quickly. Humidity levels would spike dramatically in areas where no water sources existed, then stabilize without any apparent cause. Most strange, these readings rarely corresponded to the environmental data being recorded by the museum's permanent monitoring systems. It was as if two different sets of atmospheric conditions were existing in the same spaces simultaneously. The mineral collection continued to be the most active area, but I began noticing similar phenomena in other sections. The paleontology display on the second floor started producing its own collection of unusual sounds. Not tapping this time, but what I can only describe as scraping noises, like something being dragged slowly across rough surfaces. The sounds would last for maybe 30 seconds, then stop completely. I never found out what was really happening at the Whitmore Museum. 3 weeks after Dr. Morrison gave me those instruments, I quit without notice and never went back. The final incident involved sounds I can't even begin to describe coming from every floor simultaneously, and temperature readings that defied the laws of physics. I finished my degree at a different school in a different city. Sometimes I wonder if David Castellanos experienced the same thing I did, or if the next guard after me is still there, documenting phenomena that no one will ever believe.